The movie opens in the middle of a stormy night in the outskirts of Britain, in a lavish mansion. The corridors are filled with eerie music and darkness. A man with keys jingling in his hand unlocks a room at one end of the corridor. Inside the room, a young woman, Emmeline, is standing in the corner. The man addresses her as Madam, and insists that Emmeline has some food as she is becoming weak. However, the young woman rejects him, saying she can't do it anymore. When the man is busy trying to convince her, she pushes him with great speed and rushes out of the room she was being imprisoned in. Fearfully, Emmeline walks across the corridor to another room, making sure no one notices her. In the new room, a grand piano catches her eyes. She pulls out a few strings and wraps them around her neck. Then, Emmeline ties the strings to the railing in the corridor, holds onto a heavy statue, and is ready to take the action. People are alerted, and they try to convince Emmeline to not do anything dangerous. Emmeline loudly says that it should end. She holds tight to the statue and looks down. However, determined to end her ordeal, she jumps off the railing, resulting in the separation of her head from her body. The movie shifts to New York, where Evie, a struggling artist, is spending her night doing part-time work at a catering business. The event is about a company who promises to connect individuals to their past. Evie walks from customer to customer, offering a snack, but they only look at her with an annoyed face. After the event, Evie and her friend Grace are counting their tips, when Evie finds someone's phone number on one of the cash notes. Grace asks if Evie will call the number and go on a date. Evie is absolutely not into dating at the moment, as she wants to get stable and settled in life. This leads to Grace and Evie commenting about how they handle disrespectful touching and gazing. The manager of the shift happens to hear Grace and Evie talk about such sensitive things, and tries to threaten them, saying many girls would love to take over their jobs. Evie and Grace smile nervously, recovering the situation by saying they were just joking. After the manager leaves, Grace brings out a bag with the goodies left from the event. It has some little bottles of wine and a DNA test kit. As the dawn breaks, Evie returns to her place. It's a cozy little apartment, but Evie is overdue in a lot of her payments. Changing in a comfy outfit, Evie starts preparing her clay. While listening to her mother's recording from a year ago, Evie feels lost and alone. She grabs the bag from the event to find herself a small drink. When she finds the DNA test kit, Evie takes a sip of the drink and watches the video from the company about how to send sample. Fearing she will be alone for the rest of her life, Evie decides to do the DNA test. Later, Evie and Grace are hanging out at Grace's place when Evie receives an email. Turns out she has a DNA match with a man named Oliver from England. Oliver messages Evie to meet up. Evie is excited, but Grace is skeptical about the whole arrangement. Despite Grace's doubts and warnings, Evie meets up with Oliver, who is overly excited to meet her. He wants to know all about Evie, and Evie also comfortably talks about herself and about her parents, who are no longer alive. Soon the conversation shifts to how Evie is connected to Oliver's family. According to Oliver, Evie comes from a scandalous line. Just before her nuptials in 1925, Evie's great-grandmother Emmeline had an illicit affair with a footman and kept the entire thing a secret from her whole family and her future husband. The footman took the baby and left to raise him on his own. This was a secret until Evie matched with the Alexander family, and now everyone is waiting eagerly to meet her. Evie is feeling overwhelmed with suddenly having such a huge family and becoming part of a scandalous union. Oliver takes out a couple's photo and shares that their cousin, Martin, is getting married in a few weeks. The bride-to-be is a DeVille, one of the richest families in the UK. Evie is not ready to go on such a lavish trip, but Oliver insists, saying it would be a treat from the Alexander family. Evie wants to turn him down, but this might be the last chance to meet her distant family relatives, so eventually she agrees. Within a few days, Evie lands in England, and Oliver receives her from the airport. He takes Evie to the grand estate of the DeVille family, where the Alexander family will be temporarily staying for the festivities. The huge manor of the estate takes Evie by surprise. Upon arriving, Oliver leaves to get the host, while Evie tries to text Grace. She accidentally pushes one of the maids, Dia, and breaks a crate full of champagne glasses. The caretaker, Mr. Field, finds the situation and demands that it is cleared up right away as special guests are arriving. Evie feels Mr. Field's behavior to be rude, and she retaliates. Before Mr. Field can talk back, Walt, the master of the DeVille Empire, stops him. Walt seems fascinated by Evie, and Evie also finds Walt charming. After being formally introduced by Oliver, Evie once again explains the situation so that the maids, Imogen and Dia, are not blamed for her carelessness. Mr. Field then takes Evie to her room while giving a small tour of the house on the way. He informs Evie that the library is off limits due to renovation works ongoing. Evie then meets her maid, Mrs. Swift, who looks like a lovely old woman. Evie is impressed with the room. She notices the windows are barred. Mrs. Swift explains that there are local birds that crash into the window, so the bars are there to keep them away. Evie notices a painting of a young woman, whom Mrs. Swift identifies as one of the madams of the house, who recently passed away. Evie understands the pain of losing someone, so she expresses her apologies. That night, Evie calls Grace, and they talk about her whole adventure and about Walt, when suddenly there is a loud knock on Evie's door. Walt wanted to talk to Evie about the butler, Mr. Field, and so he apologizes sincerely and hopes for a better second impression. Evie hangs up her call with Grace and goes out for a walk. While on her walk, she finds a woman staring at her from the mansion. That night, Evie wakes up in the middle of the night due to a nightmare. She sees a chair in her room and feels like someone is sitting there. As she turns on her lamp, she sees nothing out of the ordinary. Evie walks out of her room to the corridor to get some water. She sees Mr. Field gathering all the maids, saying their assignments will be given soon. As Evie tries to make sense of the situation, a ghostly appearance creeps up behind her. Evie looks and sees no one, but as soon as she turns around, she gets jump scared due to Mrs. Swift. Mrs. Swift is worried about Evie walking around in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, the servant bell from the library rings, and Mr. Field chooses Imogen to clean the library. Evie finds it odd and asks why the maids are gathered in the middle of the night. Mrs. Swift says that they are doing the final checks for the next day. She offers to make chamomile tea for Evie and takes her back to her room. Meanwhile, in the library, the room is very dark and none of the lights work. Imogen lights a few candles, puts on her headphones, and gets to work. Suddenly, something passes by, blowing out all the candles. Imogen is confused, so she tries to light them again, when suddenly she feels a presence. She sees someone sitting in the chair, but when she looks up, a pair of glowing eyes jump on top of her. The next morning, Evie is late for her family reunion. She quickly gets ready and is welcomed by Uncle Julius. When Great-Uncle Alfred makes a toast to Evie and welcomes to the family, everyone else cheers for the toast. Evie realizes that the Alexander family has many male members, but not one female member. Evie then makes a toast and expresses her gratitude. Oliver informs Evie that Walt has been asking for her since the morning. Evie shows off, saying it is common that Walt is charmed by her. On the other side of the house, Mr. Field gathers Dia and another maid to get an 1897 wine bottle from the cellar. As soon as Dia and the other girl head downstairs, he shuts the door. The cellar is spooky, and the lights flicker. The girls quickly start looking for the wine. Suddenly, Dia feels a touch on her head, but when she turns, there is no one there. She quickly finds the other girl, who shows her the label. Dia reaches for the bottle, which is stuck in the back. Suddenly, something grabs her hand and pulls her forcefully in. Dia screams, but she is more horrified about the shadow within the crevice. Evie, meanwhile, returns to her room and finds a dress prepared for her by Walt. She is impressed and captivated by the lord of the manor. That night, Evie calls Grace and fills her in on all the drama from the day. She also shows her the dress, when suddenly a bird strikes straight at her. During the night party, when Evie enters the event, Mr. Field announces Evie's entrance, which takes her by surprise. Next, the maids of honor, Victoria and Lucy, arrive at the event with a grand announcement. They immediately find Evie and chat with her. Victoria is definitely crossing the personal space with her witty insults and attitude, but Lucy is very friendly and kind. Evie asks about how they know Cecilia, the fiancée of Martin. Lucy explains how everyone in the party is connected to the DeVille family. Victoria once again invades her personal space and comments how lucky Evie that she suddenly gets included in such lavish lifestyles. Offended, Evie excuses herself and gets a refill for her drink. Lucy follows her, and as they are making small talk, Walt enters the party and immediately starts to dance with Evie. Puzzled, Evie follows Walt's directions, and after a short dance, the two escape the party and have a conversation. Walt takes Evie to a room where there are many tools to make ceramics. In the room, Walt and Evie have a heart-to-heart conversation, which leads to Walt confessing that he wants to impress her. The moment becomes more magical as the fireworks begin, and the two share a passionate kiss. However, Victoria watches them from the corner. At the end of the party, Walt bids the guests farewell when Victoria shows her jealousy over him. Walt asks her to play nice with Evie, as he is actually enjoying his time with her. Later in the night, Evie wakes up once again and hears some noise from the top of her bed. Scared, she immediately jumps under the bed. She finds a hand protruding from the top, grabbing the bed sheet. Evie gets pulled out from under the bed, and as she screams at the top of her lungs, she realizes it's Walt. Walt looks around and reassures her that it is nothing. Evie gets a cup of tea and finds Mrs. Swift cleaning the lamp she broke. She opens up to Mrs. Swift about how she feels crazy, as she has been hearing things. But before she can answer, Walt dismisses Mrs. Swift. Walt offers to stay with Evie until she falls asleep, and Evie happily accepts it. While lying down, Walt asks what Evie really wants from life. Evie honestly answers that she doesn't want to keep living paycheck to paycheck and enjoy life to the fullest. When she asks Walt the same question, he shares that he wants to share his grand life with someone exciting. He wants someone who can accept him for who he is. The following morning, Evie wakes up to a letter from Walt. Soon, Victoria and Lucy barge in and take Evie to the spa. Lucy and Evie do their nails. When Lucy starts asking questions to get to know Evie better, Victoria starts asking Evie what she knows about Walt, and it becomes a heated topic. Evie suddenly pulls away, and her nail gets cut. To make things worse, Victoria behaves rudely by sucking the wounded finger. Evie makes her way out, and on her way, secretly goes inside the library. She accidentally drops some files, and finds her details on the table. Evie is furious that Walt has been stalking her, and starts packing her luggage. Walt tries to explain why he had those papers, and manages to calm Evie down. The two have a romantic time, and confess to each other. The rehearsal dinner starts, and everyone waits for Evie's arrival. Walt addresses all the families. Evie asks Walt about the bride and the groom, to which Walt makes another announcement. The announcement takes Evie by surprise, as Walt says that it is actually her and Walt's wedding. All the guests clap, and Evie is confused to her core. Walt calls for the refreshments to be served, and a maid brings a big bowl. Suddenly, 2 butlers hold the maid as Mr. Field cuts her throat and collects her warm blood into the bowl. Evie is terrified to realize that not all the guests are human. Walt grabs a glass of fresh drink and addresses the 3 families that have gathered. Turns out, the human families have been offering their female members as brides to Walt, who is a vampire. In return, Walt fills the families with riches and security. This indicates that both Victoria and Lucy are vampires, and Walt's brides from the other 2 families. Evie's great-grandmother Emmeline was the Alexander bride, who ended her in order to stop the offerings. Now, Evie is taking her place to keep the bargain between the family. Terrified, Evie tries to exit the room, but Walt makes it clear that she can no longer leave the mansion. Evie is then carried to the basement, where she is tied down to a chair. Victoria and Lucy come to convince Evie and explain how the 4 bloodlines make them special. Turns out, Victoria has been with Walt for over 500 years, and Lucy for over 100 years. During the wedding ceremony, Evie will be bound to Walt and to his 2 brides, making them more powerful and immortal beyond time. In the basement, Victoria shows her the coffin she will be living in. She shoves Evie in and locks it, while she screams for help. The next morning, Evie hears a sound, and the coffin is opened by Mrs. Swift. She releases Evie and tells her to make a run for the airport and out of England as soon as she can. Emmeline was a dear friend of Mrs. Swift's, and she is trying to return the favor. She also teaches Evie the ways to end a vampire. As Evie runs, she is followed by Mr. Field, who has a sharp knife in his hand. Evie runs to the ice house as the men search for her. Evie thought it was a simple ice house, but it is actually used to preserve human bodies. She finds all the maids stored in the cold. Evie could hear footsteps and hid under the benches to avoid being caught. Soon, the men bring Mrs. Swift's body to the ice house, and Evie takes this chance to hide and listen. Mr. Field orders the men to search every corner of the property for Evie. Mrs. Swift, who is still dripping the red liquid, is directly on top of Evie. As her red liquid drops on Evie's face, she can't help but make a sound. When he hears the squeaky sound and looks around the ice house, Evie manages to trap him inside the ice house and make a run. As she runs through the forest, she finds her way to the village. The sun sets, and Evie knocks at the window for shelter in an elderly couple's house. At first, the elderly woman thinks of her as a beggar, but eventually lets her in. As the elderly woman serves her some chamomile tea, Evie looks around the house. The couple make a call for help. Evie is shaking, but she is a bit relieved that she is getting help. The couple inform them that a distressed young woman has escaped and looks very scared. While looking around, she sees a photo of the elderly couple with Walt and realizes they are not calling for help, but calling Walt to hand her over. Evie tries to run away by throwing the drink on the elderly man's face, but the elderly woman hits her head and she loses consciousness. While she closes her eyes, she hears the elderly woman telling her not to mess things up for all of them. When Evie wakes up, she finds herself in the library, in front of Walt. Dia is right next to her. Her strength is gone, so all she can do is talk back to Walt. Walt is impressed at Evie's attempt to escape and applauds her for her effort. As he tries to impress and convince her of how great of a life it would be if she accepts his immortality, Evie spits on Walt, proving that she wants none of his wealth and eternal life. Dia, who is in pain, regains consciousness and starts to scream with the little energy she has left. Walt takes another bite from Dia, who is barely breathing, making Evie feel disgusted. Evie loses her consciousness once again. When she regains her senses, she is already walking through the aisle. All the guests have gathered, and Great Uncle Alfred offers her to Walt. Walt is happy to see Evie next to him, and is glad she has come to her senses. The wedding ritual begins, and Walt says his, "I do." When it's Evie's turn, she goes blank. Then Evie remembers what her mother advised her for when she faces tough situations. Evie feels determined to end the facade and the sacrifices. She says, "I do." Next, Walt offers his red liquid, and she willingly drinks Walt's blood to gain his power. Evie drinks a lot, causing Walt to become slightly weak. Her transformation starts, and Evie becomes a beautiful bride for Walt. Her teeth grow sharper, her nails become longer, and her eyes change color. She now has the strength of 100 men. Evie wants to drink from Dia immediately, but it was all a disguise. Evie throws the candles and lights a fire to burn down the whole mansion. She grabs the candle holder and uses it to stab Walt right in his chest. Victoria and Lucy rush to Walt's aid, but they can't do a lot to help him. As Walt is suffering in pain, Evie goes to free Dia. All the guests exit the place due to the chaos, and Evie intently looks at Oliver, who has betrayed her the most. However, Evie doesn't want to end any humans. She then runs away with Dia, but Victoria catches up. Victoria is fuming with anger and screams at Evie, saying she already knew Evie couldn't ever be on their side. She throws Evie across the hall. Evie tries to fight back, but is easily overpowered by Victoria. As Victoria tries to wrench Evie's heart out, Dia tries to help by hitting her, but Victoria is too strong and immediately sends Dia flying. Evie asks Victoria to stop, as Walt is no more, but Victoria laughs at Evie's naivety. Evie doesn't know that she didn't actually manage to end Walt, because they are still in their immortal forms. Victoria tries to end Evie when Lucy intervenes. She wants Victoria to stop, but Victoria orders Lucy to listen to her. Lucy has had enough of Victoria controlling everything she says or does. This makes Lucy angry, and she fights back. Victoria wants to put her back in her place, and as the two fight, Lucy accidentally shoves them both through a spear of a statue. The two look at each other with sympathy and turn to ashes. Evie, who has regained her strength, finds herself confronted by Mr. Field, who charges at her with a spear. He forcefully pushes her to the other end of the hallway, while expressing his strong opposition to Evie becoming the next bride for the master. Mr. Field's anger escalates, as he mentions that he should have ended the child that Emmeline had with a servant. He talks about how he would feed the child to THR wolves. These words deeply enrage Evie, and she becomes determined to defend herself and not feel sorry for the man anymore. With a burst of strength, she breaks the spear and impales Mr. Field through the chest. As Mr. Field passes away, Evie seizes the opportunity to grab a nearby piece of string before making her way out. However, her escape is interrupted when she suddenly realizes that Walt, another adversary, is crawling on the walls, attempting to reach her. Reacting swiftly, Evie starts running, but she is eventually caught by Walt, who overpowers her. Walt questions Evie's decision to reject the allure of fame, wealth, and eternal life while tightening his grip around her neck. Despite being choked, Evie remains resolute and asserts her desire for freedom, making it clear that she is not impressed by Walt's arrogant nature. Walt, considering modern women to be ungrateful, continues his assault. However, Evie manages to retrieve the string she earlier acquired and uses it to cut off Walt's hand. In excruciating pain, Walt screams and tries to grab Evie, but his power and blood loss have already weakened him significantly. Evie seizes the opportunity to kick Walt into the fire, causing him to burn. As Walt meets his fiery demise, Evie's physical appearance returns to normal, with her nails and teeth no longer in a beastly state. The mansion they are in begins to burn down around her, symbolizing the destruction of the oppressive world she has escaped. Evie walks out of the burning mansion with her human life and freedom. 2 weeks later, Oliver, presumably facing the consequences of Evie's actions, prepares to flee. He believes that Evie has lost her special powers and can no longer harm him or anyone else. However, at the same time, Evie and Grace are on their way to confront Oliver in his office. The movie ends with Evie and Grace walking towards the office to seek revenge on Oliver.